I'm really excited to introduce our panel tonight. We call ourselves New Directions in Education Abroad. We talk about Generation Z, we talk about diversity and inclusion, career readiness, and the K-12 space. And you are going to be hearing from all 6 of us that you can see on the screen this evening in our final session. So welcome. We are glad you're here. Oh, I think you're on mute, Sarah. We'll go ahead and introduce ourselves.
Tech fail right from the get-go. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Dart. I'm Vice President with Education in Ireland. I'm based up in Boston, and I am very much identify as a millennial.
Hi, good afternoon, friends. My name is Malaika Marble Serrano, and I'm VP for Diversity and Inclusion with World Strides Higher Ed. I am calling in from sunny Atlanta, Georgia, and I identify as being a proud member of Generation X.
Hello, friends. My name is Candace Ricks. I am in Washington, D.C., here in the Capitol. I usually work as a regional director managing the Northeast states with World Strides International Studies Abroad. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today.
Awesome. And I'm Michaela Mathry. I'm the Director of Marketing and Client Experience over at Via TRM. And as I mentioned, I am based in Brooklyn in New York.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Washington, D.C. And like Candace, hi, I'm Suzanne Fiesme. That's kind of important. Like Candace, I am usually a regional director for the Mid-Atlantic with ISA, and I am a millennial.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lamar Chambly. I'm the founder and executive director of Teens of Color Abroad, calling in from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I identify as a chat room millennial to the core. So really excited to kick this off today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Malaika.
Thanks, friends. I'm already laughing and having a great time. This is fantastic. So if you haven't already noticed, New Directions crew, we love to have fun and we keep it 100. So today we are going to have a high impact, high power experience. The 6 of us are going to be delivering very concise TED Talks, and then we're going to come back together as a community, and we're going to have Q&A facilitated by none other than Samantha Martin, who of course is the CEO and founder of VIA. And so now, our next slide, we have some community requests. We're ready to do this. Perfect. All right. So we're going to hit the next slide. So New Directions crew, we have some community requests and guiding principles. So of course, the conference theme is being bold, and we want to encourage all of us to lean into that. So what do we mean by that? Being vulnerable, showing up authentically, being courageous by challenging the status quo, as well as taking risks and admitting when, sometimes I might not know something, but I'm always open to learning. And so leading into those guiding principles, we honor wellness. We are always constantly learning. We're about making room. So what does that mean exactly? If during the Q&A, you notice that you're kind of talking a lot, or there's someone else who might have something to say, but hasn't yet had an opportunity to do so, we want to make room and make space for our friends to contribute. Allowing for discomfort, we lean into discomfort and don't walk away from it. And then finally, we like to take lessons but leave stories. And this is really truly honoring confidentiality. So hopefully, community, this feels good to us. And we're going to keep rolling with the next slide. All right. So all of us have access to the chat feature. So as we did our introductions, we all shouted out or represented which generation that we are a part of or affiliate with. So now it's your turn, community. We want to know who is in the room. If you are Gen X or Millennial, Gen Z, Baby Boomer, Silent Generation, or you just prefer to self-describe, by all means, please feel free and drop that information in the chat. We cannot wait to see who's here in the room. So as far as the international education community goes, who's in the room? Far and away, millennials are where it's at in terms of international education representation, closely followed by Gen X, Baby Boomers, the mature silent generation, and then there are some folks who like to color outside the lines and self-describe. So that's who's represented in international education. And now that we know who's in the room, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my friend Sarah, who's going to kick us off.
Sarah, you might be on mute.
Yeah, thanks. I have a challenge with that apparently. Thank you so much, Malika. So who are we talking about here? So Generation Z refers to the group of the population who was born between about 1995 and 2010. So these are the students that we've been seeing in our classrooms and on our programs for the last few years, and that we're going to continue to see for about the next decade. Now, moving on to the next slide, when we talk about generations, we are necessarily talking in generalities, not stereotypes, but generalizations. And part of the reason that we can talk about generations like this is because generations are shaped by shared seminal events that collectively influence who they become. Now, for millennials, this was very clearly 9/11. But for Gen Z, now if you had asked me 6 months ago what it was for Gen Z, I would have told you that it was the recession that began in 2008. And it's true that did have a really strong impact, that experience of watching their older siblings and parents struggle with job loss and financial insecurity did have a tremendous impact on them. We also now have to take into account the events of the last 4 months, because for Gen Z, this shared context has actually become a lot more of a shared struggle. So moving on to the next slide, we'll see that a report from the APA reported that 68% of Gen Z adults said that they feel significantly stressed about the future of our country. And this statistic is actually from before COVID. So before 2020, they were already taking to the streets, raising their voices against climate change and gun violence. But now you add to that bleak economic and job prospects, a killer virus, and a reckoning around the lack of justice for Black victims of police violence. All of this is nothing short of trauma. And to be clear, this is trauma that is disproportionately felt by the Black and brown members of Gen Z, because the virus is affecting communities of color at much higher rates. And people of color are experiencing police violence at much higher rates. Now, this is upsetting, right? We should be upset. We are upset. But moving on to the next slide, I think Gen Z actually really gives us some reasons to feel optimistic. And if we're willing to listen, they actually have a lot that they can teach us. Now, one of the things that I find to be most interesting about this group is that while they're definitely stressed about the future of the country, and they obviously have good reason to be, they also have this abiding faith in their ability to make a difference. This was captured really well in this piece in the Pacific Standard. A young reporter took a road trip and she spoke to Gen Zers across the whole country. And first she asked them, what do you think about the future of our country? And they used words like scary and dumpster fire. But then she asked them, what do you feel about your future? And over again, she heard words like hopeful and determined. So this is what journalist David Whitman refers to as the optimism gap. Essentially, they're optimistic about their own future, but when they zoom out and take the wide view of what's going on in America, that optimism turns to pessimism. But the thing is, this gap is actually kind of a good thing, because if you ask Gen Z what they're most afraid of, it's things staying the same. And if you ask them what makes for a meaningful life, they'll tell you it's making a mark, and they are making a mark. Now, moving on, unless you've been living under a rock, you know what happened at Trump's rally in Tulsa a few weeks ago. But in case you missed it, here's the short version. In the days leading up to the rally, organizers claimed that more than 1 million people had reserved tickets. And then, when the day of the event arrived, a mere 6,000 showed up at the arena. So what happened? Well, Gen Z happened. It was TikTok users and K-pop fans who circulated a secret online campaign encouraging people to reserve tickets, but to not actually attend the event, which thereby threw off the attendance projections and also skewed a serious load of campaign data. It was really the perfect socially distant protest, but it was also a massive demonstration of the power of Gen Z and social media. Now, in this next slide, speaking of the power of Gen Z and social media, these ladies are the organizers of the Black Lives Matter March in Nashville. As the protests were starting to unfold across the country, Z Thomas looked around and she wondered why no one was marching in Nashville. So she got online and she took to Twitter and Instagram and started talking with other young people who were interested in organizing. Within a few days, she and 5 other women led a march of 10,000 people through their city. She's 15. Y'all, they may not be able to vote yet, but they do know how to make their voices heard. And you'll notice that I mentioned that she met her fellow organizers online. And if we move on to the next slide, I think we will find that that really isn't surprising because this generation is more connected than any before. 1995 marks not only the first birth year of this generation, but the first year the internet was commercialized. And so it's said that Gen Z was born with a smartphone in hand. And indeed, 97% own a smartphone. And on average, they spend 4 hours a day online, which is a statistic that to me already seemed low even before the pandemic. Now, since the emergence of COVID, social media engagement is actually up 61%. Online is where they are. And so if you want to engage with students, it's also where you need to be. Now, moving on, I would say one of the things that's really quite interesting about Gen Z, and this is in contrast to their millennial predecessors, is that they're very financially savvy. If they're going to make a big investment, they want to know what the return on that investment is going to be before they lay down the funds. And this is even more true when you're talking about something as serious as which college to attend or whether to study abroad. And this is tied really directly to that recession in 2008, where they watched wages stagnate and student debt skyrocket. And they were like, yep, we don't want that life. We're not about that. Which is why 12% of Gen Z is already saving for retirement. Now, when did I start saving for retirement? Like 3 years ago. So, like I said, we have quite a bit to learn from them. All in all, I would say that this generation is the first that really is more similar to their peers across the globe than they are different. And I think one of the things that's interesting in this next slide is that you can see these photos, which really, they come from around the globe. And this reason that I can say, I think that they're so much more similar than different is in part about that shared struggle, because that crisis in 2008 really was a worldwide catastrophe. But the other reason why this is true is because of technology and social media, because they're just so connected. I mean, don't forget that when Facebook launched, the oldest of Gen Z was only 9. So this has always been their reality. So these marches and protests, this taking to the street and raising their voices, it's not just happening here in the US, it's worldwide. The pictures are in Cape Town and Seoul and New York City, but in a lot of ways, to me, they actually feel so similar, they almost could have been taken anywhere. It really is this activism that stands out to me as the defining factor that shows just how like-minded this group is across borders and how connected they really are. Interestingly, they're also the most diverse generation that we've ever seen in America. But for more on that, I will go ahead and pass you over to my friend Malika.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was excellent. So who are we talking about? As Sarah mentioned before, we are talking about the most diverse generation yet. Next slide, please. So, against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the support for racial and LGBTQ equality, this year, 2020, has been monumental for so many reasons. And with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, 2020 is also pivotal because this is the first time in US history that those who are under the age of 18 actually racially are there are more percentages of students of people of color than there are white folks. So America is changing, 2020, y'all. The focus of my kind of short comments today are going to be centering around diversity and inclusion, but also looking at disrupting outdated narratives of who's coming to college, the face of study abroad, and the bold steps that we all can take to increase access. So these images that we have on the screen here, a lot of you who are millennials or Gen X or baby boomers on the line, these will look very familiar to you because these are all the images that we grew up with. And the reason I wanted to lift these up is because we're looking at how our ideas around who goes to college, who's studying abroad are shaped even before the time we even get there. And so the next slide that I want to show is actually looking at disrupting those sort of former old narratives of who goes to college, but then looking at the reality. And so while your own experience may have been one of that you saw before, who's actually coming here? If we look at the next slide, thanks to our friends at the Gates Millennium Foundation, looks very different today. And so nearly 45% of students who are going to campus today, going to college today, are students of color. 38% are receiving a Pell Grant, 45% are over the age of 21, and nearly 1 in 3 have children. And so when we think about and pivot to education abroad, do we have these students in mind as we are planning our programs, as we're designing our marketing materials? So in the next slide, we're going to take a look at an old study abroad narrative. So again, this is a nod to the Gen Xers and the older millennials in the room. These images probably look familiar to you. And again, when we think about unconscious biases and images and how they really have an effect on how we market, design, and advise students, we really need to be mindful about what we've seen in the past and how that might unconsciously play out in our work and present day. So the next slide that I want to show is looking at historic frameworks and who's been underrepresented in education abroad and why. And so some of you on the line may be familiar with the 4Fs framework, which is family, fear, finances, and faculty. Now, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that these 4Fs do exist, but I also want us to kind of flip the script and take a look in the mirror. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, let's think about us as education abroad advisors and faculty and other stakeholders. Deficit thinking paradigm is something that is pervasive within our space. And what that means is it places the blame of underachievement on historically marginalized populations without taking into account systematic structural racism and other social inequalities. Now, why is that important? It's important because for far too long, there's been too much energy that's been centered around what the students don't have, but yet not thinking about what can we be doing to be bold, to be different, to change our perspectives. And so some deficit thinking things you may have heard of have been, if only their parents valued the experience, they'd study abroad. Or if only they'd started saving sooner, they could study abroad. These are all statements that are rooted in deficit thinking, and that's something that we are looking to disrupt. So next slide. Going back to Gen Z, inclusive pedagogy tells us that our identities, both apparent and non-apparent, frame and shape how we view the world and how the world views us. Now on your screen, you'll see someone who looks kind of familiar. And she's the same person. However, when this individual travels around the world, suddenly, magically, her race, her nationality, her color, it changes. Why is that? It's not magic. It's called context. And it is so important. It is mission critical that we acknowledge that this is reality. Furthermore, Gen Z, unlike other previous generations, has the language and they have the agency to have these conversations around social identities. And the other key component is that they not only have that agency in the language, they are expecting to have the conversation, they're expecting to have it with you. So in the next slide, again, kind of sitting with who are we, who's in the room. Our friends at Diversity Abroad over the last few years have been doing a great survey. I'm not going to read all of the pieces that are here on the screen, but I did want to lift up just a couple. So our field, which is probably not a surprise to many in the room, is roughly 76% female, 65% of folks who are study abroad faculty and staff identify as being white, 35% persons of color. As far as our friends in the LGBTQ plus community go, nearly 20% identify in that way. I think something that's interesting here is that nearly 1 in 3 folks identify as being first generation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to do some more sort of community building. So finally, last slide that I have here is looking at what can we do? So this is where that agency comes into play. So hopefully you're feeling inspired. And the last things that I want to leave us with are just 4 things. The first is thinking about unconscious bias, the perception versus reality. The second is the social identity piece. So again, Gen Z is engaging in these conversations. And so we must unpack our own identities and create space for these discussions. The third piece is agency. Agency. What institutional barriers can we dismantle? And then finally, representation matters, y'all. Looking at how we must diversify staff, faculty program directors, peer advisors to foster inclusion and belonging in our field. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my good friend, Candace Ricks.
Thank you, Malika. First, before I start, I want to say that I realize that I did not say what generation I'm a part of. And I think it's really important for me to state that I am a millennial, but I do have Gen Z like tendencies. So, as a former classroom teacher that's been privileged to work with a diverse range of students all around the world, I've often been tasked with asking the question of how do I get my students to buy into what it is that I have to say? What or who are their influencers? But asking that question, I realized required me to really understand what it is that they value and to contextualize their current experience. And in my personal research, I've found that yes, absolutely, teachers and parents still have an impact. But this generation overwhelmingly looks to their peers or their friends when it comes to making decisions. And in the next slide, you'll see that to help me in understanding their values, I had to consider the concept of friendship, asking myself, what does it mean to be a friend to Gen Z? Now, society, pop culture, and technology have all shifted over the last decade, as Sarah and Malika have, so clearly stated. And the 6 values that follow belong to a model that I created, and it's called the Friend Framework, which examines both the characteristics of a friend as well as serving as guiding points on how we can be friendly to Gen Z. So, the first point of the framework on the next slide is F. Now, F on the next slide stands for speaking facts. This generation values and is seeking truth, and they have technology at their fingertips. So that means that they can fact check anything. They're also seeking more of their own personal truth, creating communities that align with their identities and values on places like YouTube and TikTok. So this picture right here is a photo of a couple or friend couple rather named Damon and Joe who are in charge of a group called Shut Up and Go because they studied abroad in Paris and they wanted to create a community for more students who wanted to do the same. On the next slide, you'll see that we have R. R stands for realistic and relatable. This generation absolutely values authenticity. And as Sarah stated, they're definitely more pragmatic because of how they were raised in a time of financial uncertainty. They're well aware of the reality that they've inherited. So they value relatable voices that encourage them really to lean into themselves. I really love this photo right here of the accidental icon because she became a great hit with Gen Z just by being herself. On the next slide, you'll see that we have I. Now, I stands for inclusive and an individual. So this generation I found, they honor individuality and inclusivity both in spaces and in brand. So today's students want to define themselves on their own terms, and it's clear that they really do have the space to do it. All right, on the next slide, we have E. E stands for ethical experiences. So Sarah stated earlier that they're seen as activists, and it's very true that they care about a wide range of causes, including things like sustainability and immigration, as well as racial injustice. And I think it's important to point out again that they also understand their own power to influence, and they've enacted group tactics many times over in order to move the masses. So think cancel culture. If you look here at this quote, you'll see that 40% said that they have stopped purchasing or boycotted a brand based on what it is that they felt they stood for. And I think that now more than ever, we have a plethora of examples of how they've done that. And the next point is N. Now, when I think about no boundaries, I think of the phrase customization is king. These students live in a borderless, interconnected world, and they absolutely value creativity and, again, authenticity. It's clear that they want to feel heard and they want to feel that they have the freedom to create their own narratives, experiences, and realities. They're digital storytellers and they're masters at being everywhere at once. And I want to point out on this screen the quote that says, you have to completely remove any sense of binaries or rules for this generation. And the yellow picture in the middle is from the Snapchat Studio Lens app, which essentially gave over power on Snapchat for students to create, and they have been creating so much. Now, the last point, which is D, is my favorite, stands for engage in critical dialogue. Malika already mentioned this, but this generation is definitely equipped to articulate how they feel, and they even expect this regarding any number of topics, regarding politics and even identity. So this has been normalized today compared to the past when certain topics or expressions were seen as taboo. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see for me, I really had to reckon with the idea and the question of what about my friends, right? I can know something, but we want to move from concept to action. So I went out and I looked in perused through social media to see which brands are doing it right. How are certain brands and organizations and influencers actually connecting to Gen Z? So there's 4 different tiers of influencers that I'll leave you with. And the first one on the next slide is our mega influencers. And I've talked about BTS before because I'm almost a little bit obsessed with them. But the most important thing to know about mega influencers is that they have a really huge and wide reach. It's a distant relationship. However, they do have the ability to connect with their followers. So in this picture here, you'll see that BTS is focusing on a campaign that they did with UNICEF. But I think it's also really important for us to know in the study abroad world that numbers have been going up with regard to students who are interested in studying abroad in South Korea, and the government has enacted a plan to help to grow that number. So I think we should all say thank you, BTS. On the next slide, the next level is macro influencers. And macro influencers tend to be self-made. Again, they preach pragmatism, excuse me. And it's really important to note that they create their own community for a targeted audience. And for me, a person who perfectly exemplifies this is Jamie Rains, who is a transgendered man who back in 2011 created his own little piece on YouTube to help start a dialogue about what the trans journey was. And one of the most important videos to me was the one that said, "I hate having periods." So again, finding a way to create space and to share identity, even if you're not in the same location as someone. The next piece on the next spot is micro influencers. So micro influencers are seen as experts with strong bonds, and they are niche specialists. And I really love to highlight a group like No Madness Travel Tribe, which is led by a dynamic Black woman named Evita Robinson, because this group serves as a urban travel community. And when you think about Evita's story as someone who taught in Japan, coming home, not knowing who she could talk to or how she could relate, she began to create her own community. And it's become wildly popular amongst Gen Z and students who are seeking to study abroad, because how often have we had students come and ask the question of, what is it like to be Black in? What is it like to be trans in? So again, this is a perfect example of communities and spaces that are being created for Gen Z to find space. All right, the last level of influencers are our nano influencers. And yes, that is a picture of me with my Laotian family during PMI. Nano influencers, the most important piece about this is that they're regular everyday people. They have high engagement as well as high buying conversion. And for me, when I go out onto campuses and I'm speaking in my everyday life, I try to exist as an opportunity architect, sharing my own personal experiences so that people will look at me as a trusted advisor. And this doesn't have to necessarily be someone who's working. It could absolutely be someone who is a peer advisor or an ambassador. So I think that, moving to the next slide, what I would want everyone to consider is when you look at this framework, how is it that you are choosing to be a friend to Gen Z? How are you considering their values and contextualizing the current experience that they're having in order to align what it is that you're offering? So I think that Michaela can speak more about this in the next section, but I'm really, really looking forward to unpacking this with you all during the breakout section. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Candy. I always learn so much from you and your expertise. And I'd love for people to put in the chat, actually, a response to her question about how are you a friend to Gen Z. In this section, I am talking about marketing. Marketing actually both to Generation Z, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about what it looks like to market and communicate with your institution or organization. So on the next slide, I've got my intro. There is no substitute for experiences abroad. I think given our current context and what is going on right now, we can all agree that when it comes to study abroad, most often what we are selling, and we are selling something, to students is an experience. We're selling an experience. And right now, that experience or that product is grounded. And on to the next slide. But is it? So perhaps travel is grounded. What I am wondering and what I'm thinking about is internationalization as we know it grounded right now? I think physically we're all coming obviously from, we're at home right now as we're presenting, and we're all distributed all over the world. And we have all been given a bit of a pause. So I like to really go high level and kind of zoom out when I think about the role of marketing and communication. And the question I pose is, what can we find in this pause? While travel's grounded, my travel schedule completely changed this spring, as I'm sure many of yours did. I want to know, how can we look critically at internationalization and how we communicate about it? And then, perhaps most importantly to me, how do we share that story of the work that we're doing in a way that resonates with students and with our audience? Here's a little marketing humor for you. Marketing 101 is right person, right message, right time. And I think when it comes to our current environment, most of us can agree that we still know, quote unquote, the right person. At VIA-TRM, we like to say every student is the right student. What I'm curious about, though, is what is the right message in this moment? And when is the right time to share that message? I have heard this so many times, both in the study abroad space and in my personal life, right? It's time to create a new normal. We're walking into a new normal. I've heard a lot of people say, we need to reinvent study abroad. In the next slide, I question that. And I wonder, is reinventing or study abroad, is that enough? Perhaps it's actually time to radicalize. And actually, I will put this out there that I think some folks are doing this already. Radicalize internationalization. To be radical means that you are only looking for rapid social change. And the question that I pose and that I think about is, how can we as an industry use this moment to get radical and do some of the work that needs to be done in order to reach students and to flip the script? I had to go back and remind myself of the definition, so I'm sharing that here as well. On ACE's website, what they say is that part of internationalization is about engaging and preparing students to be citizens of a multicultural community, both at home and in a globalized world. And I know something that I am thinking a lot about right now is what that looks like at home, and how are we addressing the issues. And Malika brought this up in her presentation as well, that 65% of our industry is white folks, right? So she said, look in the mirror, and what does our industry look like? And that's not representative of the space or the students that we're serving. So I'm bringing you into some of my own work, and this quote really resonated with me when I think about white supremacy in our fields. And this relates to communication and marketing in a lot of ways, because we infuse who we are into what we put out into the world, whether it's a social media post or an email or an advising session with a student. I'm going to read this one out loud. Your desire to be seen as good can actually prevent you from doing good, because if you do not see yourself as part of the problem, you cannot be a part of the solution. This is from a great book called Me and White Supremacy. So I always want to center in the work that you do before you get to marketing. And that's why I bring this up in this moment. And this is something that I am thinking a lot about as well. Marketing strategy is really powerful. And I'm thinking and want to share a couple of ideas here when it comes to communicating the value of your office, the value of internationalization, the value of what you do both to your campus or your organization. So being able to speak clearly about what you bring and why it's valuable. And also obviously to students who are our main constituents and who we're trying to reach. And on the next slide, it's always important to me to share practical things, to both think about the why and then to think about the how. So I'm going to share 3 ways that you can use marketing practices to show the value of the work you do, to stay relevant at your university or institution or college, and connect with students. The first one is search for the authentic. I can't emphasize this enough. Sarah said this in her presentation. For students to want new experiences, you need to find their barriers and speak to them in a way that resonates. This generation is really looking for that. They want raw, unedited, and they want to be seen and heard. So I'm just going to pose a question. Can we vote to outlaw the phrase, "it'll change your life"? Because I think that does us a disservice in the industry. And on the next slide, I'll go through the next ones kind of quick. My next tip is that the medium is the message. When it comes to internationalization, we are not the only game in town. Like Sarah said, students are having this conversation. If you don't believe me, download TikTok and just look at Gen Z. Look at what they're talking about. Look at what they're posting. My question for us as practitioners is, how are we joining the conversation? How are we listening? And also, how are we sharing the mic with the students that are having these conversations? And then my third tip is be specific, not generic. If I see another marketing message that says, with recent events, I'm gonna be a little frustrated. Just say what you mean. If you're talking about the revolution against police brutality, say it. Same things in terms of your strategy. I have heard folks, and I've been guilty of this myself, saying, we want to diversify study abroad. What does that mean? Do you want more Black students to go abroad? Do you want more men to go abroad? Be specific, because language is really important. And then I'm going to show real quickly a couple of great examples. Go over to Instagram, follow No White Saviors. Their content is awesome and authentic. And then I have this student on TikTok that I shared a post of earlier. Yeah, these are some great resources and folks really doing the work and putting out things that I think resonate and are honest and true. And with that, I'm going to pass off the baton to Suzanne.
Thanks, Michaela. Okay, so let's talk about what's on Gen Z's mind, which is getting a job, right? Gen Z students are going to college and they're expecting that return on investment that Sarah was talking about. If we go to the next slide, even prior to COVID-19, they've had this sense of urgency to get hired immediately, preferably prior to graduation. And they do believe that it's their higher ed institution's responsibility to help them achieve that goal. But considering increasing costs with higher ed and COVID-19 impacting the job market, they're really hyper aware of the risk and sacrifice associated with attending a higher ed institution. Next slide. So for recent graduates and current students, they're facing the worst job market since the Great Depression. They've got student loans to pay back, and that plan that they may have had in place may or may not be looking as likely right now. Next slide. So looking at the job market and recent graduates, and click ahead. 22%, as of mid-April, 22% companies were considering resending job offers according to NACE. And we do know that many did. And if we go to the next one, studies show that graduates who come into the job market during a recession have employment rates that are 1% to 2% lower than their peers who graduate during a healthier job market. We're not talking the immediate years following a recession, we're talking long-term impact. So of course, concerns about future careers and student debt are realer than ever for recent grads, but also for current students and those making the decision to pursue higher ed after high school, which brings us to enrollment. I don't know about y'all, but I've seen enrollment projections all over the place. This projection was pretty much everywhere a couple of months ago, but then, sort of after that June 1st decision date, we're seeing a different story with regards to enrollment for domestic students. Slide. Another study showed, 57% of students were reconsidering their top choice school. And then finally, 1 in 6 students questioning their return to campus. That was from a study by the Art and Science group. Go to the next slide. So, as I said, enrollment projections are kind of all over the place. But for the most part, students are having to make these decisions without really knowing what their fall is going to look like. Many institutions have really provided incomplete plans for reopening by these decision dates for students. We've seen everything from online classes to hybrid programs, freshmen only living on campus, no in-person meetings for student organizations, and even living assignments based on sports teams and class rosters. There are a lot of changes coming for the fall, and for the most part, we don't have a full picture of what that looks like or how students will embrace it. And considering, what Candace had to say about no boundaries, I don't know what to anticipate. But what we do know is that Gen Z does highly value these networking and extracurricular opportunities for their higher ed experience. Those opportunities are going to help them with their future career. But what happens if those can't be available in a way that students find value? We'll go to the next slide. And then in all of this, there's the question of how we make a case for international education in a COVID-19 world. Yeah, go COVID state. Next slide. So when I've presented on this topic in the past, I really make the case for international education with a focus on skills development. We need our students to get skills focused because employers are skills focused. And if we go to the next slide, you can see these skills that I've highlighted that I always talk about that we know our students gain when they're studying or researching or interning abroad. And let's go to the next slide. And I don't want to leave out digital tech for those students who were studying abroad in the spring and then also doing programs or online classes this summer, because it's definitely a skill that they've all further developed. But when I do think about the issue of demonstrating the need for international education, the value of it during a COVID-19 world, I still think that there's an emphasis on skills. I still think that that needs to be the way to go. But I do think that we need to think differently and we need to think boldly. Next slide. So these are just some ideas that based on, reading and brainstorming and all of the different opportunities for webinars that I've started thinking, what I would like to see, what is my emboldened vision for the future of ed abroad. And with this first one, skills-focused courses, you might be thinking to yourself, A, how is this thinking boldly? My school already has these. And B, what does this have to do with me? Well, actually, this is a really excellent time to look at partnering with academic departments, your career services office, local employers, and overseas partners, and identify which courses are already available or which need to be developed, and how you can all collaborate, and you can be that kind of fusion for all of these different groups to collaborate to create unique hands-on and perhaps virtual opportunities for students to be able to learn a skill that's field specific. And you could even look at, considering having a LinkedIn badge attached with these. That would be something that Gen Z would really value. We'll go to the next one. So career-focused projects. I was on an interesting webinar with Brandon Bastide from Kaplan, and long-term projects were one of the innovative ideas for higher ed that he was discussing. So these are semester or longer projects that students work on to prepare them for related projects in their future careers. And these could easily be incorporated into future faculty-led abroad programs, virtual exchanges, or created as a requirement for students going abroad in the future. Next one. Professional portfolios. So I've seen a couple of programs that do this. They assist students in developing a professional portfolio. And this is something that could be really valuable to Gen Z students in terms of helping them be able to showcase their college experience in a meaningful way to their future employers. And this could even be done through something like digital storytelling projects and that they could showcase via social media. But I think it's really something that we should consider incorporating into international ed because we know, it's not enough for students to just put their study abroad program on their resume. And we also know that our students don't always do the best job at articulating their experience. And then finally, micro internships. Now, we all know that there's been a ton of discussion around virtual internships since COVID, right? We don't know what the value is of them. We have concerns, but these could really be a super unique opportunity for students. So for instance, like what would it look like to create a course where in partnership with a provider or an overseas partner, and one of your faculty members is teaching a course on a specific field-related concept, but students are doing a corresponding micro internship. Essentially, they're working on a small project, and they could do this individually or in a cohort, but they're working for an international organization virtually in correlation with that class taught by the professor. So no, these are just some of the ways that I've been thinking things that I would really like to see moving forward in Ed Abroad. But I do think that it's important that we remain in this bold mindset, right? Like I'm really excited to see the projects that that come out of this from being in this seminar. But go to the next slide. But I do think it's important that we stay in this mindset and that we encourage others to get into this mindset with thinking about the future as well. Michaela kind of, touched on, we're all talking about the new normal, but I've heard a lot of people saying things like, when things get back to normal or when it's safe for students to travel again. And I think that we need to understand both the nuance in these statements and recognize, as Brene Brown said, normal never was. So it's time to fully embrace opportunities for change and innovation and growth in Ed Abroad. And with that, I will hand it over to Lamar to close us out.
All right, so I have the most difficult job to follow up from these beautiful, brilliant women and all of their advice, but I'm gonna do my best. And so as I introduced earlier about Teens of Color Abroad, also known as TOCA, our mission is to address the racial disparity that exists in study abroad by providing high school students of color with language immersion study abroad programs. We see language as the pathway toward global citizenship. And so this mission was conceived, obviously, in the old world. To give you some background on how we're transitioning into our new world, TOCA is partnering with the organization Natakalam to virtually connect globally minded US high school students of color with educators from the Middle East who are refugees. And so this summer, our students will take small group Arabic classes daily and participate in cultural exchange sessions with refugees to learn more about their lived experiences. And so as a natural optimist, I wanted to start my presentation with sharing with you 3 Gen Z student stories, 3 little nuggets of gold, 2 quotes from student applicants. I dubbed them Gen Z generated droplets of optimism during these seemingly bleak times, and then a poignant reflection from one of my former high school Spanish students. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll start with nugget of optimism number 1. From this very first quote from a student who applied to our summer language learning and cultural exchange program. I don't want to read the entire quote, but I love that the student ended with, it would help me learning Arabic. It would help me better communicate with my family abroad, as well as connect me to my roots. And that just jumped out to me, especially as an organization that's focused on students of color. In the face of COVID, students that we'll call SAM, see the value in language learning and the connection that it has to enriching their self-identity and building a larger connection to their own community. So even in the face of this virus, this passion still exists from students. Moving on to nugget of optimism number 2. Oh, you can go back. This is this second quote. And this student said that it is exciting to have a dialogue with people from another culture and learn more about their communities. Now, I want to be a little bit clear about this. This student applied from a small rural town that is only 5% Black. This is a young Black teenager. And even from this town with a lack of diversity, she felt compelled to foster a bridge connecting communities across race. And so it's just beautiful, even in this bleak time, to recognize that this passion for language learning and this passion to connect with students across race still exists. Gen Z high school students are still interested in the world and the beauty of building cross-cultural relationships. This passion will not die with the pandemic. And so if I can give you anything just to like hold on to cling on to, it would be that. And so my third nugget of optimism, this is now on the next slide. I want to introduce to you my former student, Supreme. Supreme was the rock star, valedictorian of her class with a razor sharp wit. Supreme received a passport scholarship on behalf of teens of color abroad. And so before she went on to Brown University, we provided her with a passport, just in case she wanted to study abroad in college, that she would be passport ready. And so when she received this passport, I interviewed her and wanted to know, where is she interested in traveling to? And I want to quote some of her words and what she said, but she realized and recognized her privilege as a Westerner, that no matter of her background as a Black woman, she knew she had a very Westernized perspective and wanted to travel the world to know and learn more about global Black communities. As she develops her own understanding of what it means to be a Black woman, she wanted to travel throughout the world to learn more about global Black communities. And I just thought that that was incredibly powerful. Next slide, especially because in my classroom, I had this huge poster printed on a bulletin board with a map outlining the transatlantic slave trade in an effort to show my students where the intersection of Blackness and Latinidad originated. My students gravitated toward this identity development and loved discovering how their Caribbean cultures overlapped with seemingly foreign ones. And so next slide. Students like Supreme loved learning and reciting poetry. And so what I tried to do as a Spanish teacher was to invoke their love of identity with their love of language. And so we learned Victoria Santa Cruz's Me Gritaron Negra, where in this poem she says in Spanish, y bendigo al cielo porque quiso Dios que negro azabache fuese mi color. And so for those of you that don't speak Spanish, I love this. She says, and blessed are the heavens because God wanted jet black to be my color. And so even within this poetry, we were able to look at go verbs, bendecir. We were able to look at the preterite with the verb quiso, and then also have it rooted in this powerful poetry. Students felt empowered. They felt inspired. They felt affirmed. And next slide. And so what I've just seen in my teaching experience is many schools across the country, especially schools with students from low-income backgrounds, the increased focus on high-stakes testing robs many students of that space to embrace their identity development. Students are shepherded through AP classes in hopes to score high GPAs to draw the eyes of prestigious four-year universities like yours. And next slide. And I just think that we're at a pivotal stage in addressing social issues in America. The foot is on the gas, and y'all, there's no turning back. As educators, we must work to affirm, to advocate for, and to defend our students, especially students from historically marginalized identities and communities. And so next slide, what I wanted to do before this presentation was I sent out a survey to my former students who are heading into college to see how they're feeling about going into college during the virus and during this time of social unrest. And so I wanted to share with you something that I heard from a student. And I won't read the whole quote, but I love that at the very end of the student, she felt comfortable enough to advocate for herself, which is something I always push my students to do. And she said a step further would be providing students with counseling so that they can better cope with these issues. You are going to have a slew of students who are proud of who they are. And I want you all to use this time to help solidify that for them, but to also provide them with the resources that they need to take care of themselves. And so if we could go to the next slide, if I could share any call to action, I would ask you all to use this time to assess how your office supports Black students and students of color with diverse and inclusive resources that directly address their needs. Is there a space for Black students and other students of color to share their concerns about studying abroad? How are they supported when they're back on campus? And as travel is grounded for the moment, please take inventory on how you're creating these spaces, who's involved, and how to ensure that our students and their well-being are at the center of everything that we do. So thank you very much. I'm going to end it there and pass it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Lamar, for sharing those nuggets of optimism. And thank you to the New Directions crew for bringing us home here at the Bold Seminar. I feel inspired. I feel grateful for your work, for your boldness, and for sharing who you are and what you are doing in the world. Here's what I'm going to propose we do. It's 3, which means it's the official close of Bold. So folks who need to go get, kids or go back to your responsibilities at home, we understand, and we are so grateful that you were able to join us for this hour to meet New Directions and hear about their students and their work. For those of you who want to stay for a Q&A after party, that's about what we're about to do right now. So we welcome you to stay for a little bit longer, as long as, let me check in with the New Directions crew to make sure, is that okay with you all? We hadn't talked about that if we go over. Yeah?
We plan for 5:30, Samantha, so we're all good.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with a bold question that came from the student panel right before this one. And this is for all of you. So what is possible now that wasn't possible before? And I'm thinking about this in relationship, certainly, of course, to COVID, the anti-racism movement, to higher education, having a serious shakeup, to what's going on in the digital environment and all the questions there. And we can expand that as broad as you want to go. So I open this to the entire group. And again, what is possible now that wasn't possible before?
I'll jump
Lamar.
in here. Greater access, increased access to opportunities that foster cross-cultural and language learning opportunities. So for example, when we announced the summer program for TOCA, we received over 157 applications for students from all over the country. And so there were students, as I stated earlier, from rural Virginia, Memphis, LA, New York, but then also rural Texas and some other places that, as an organization leader, I would have never been able to reach those students. So I'm really excited to see how these international spaces are creating the beginning of a journey for so many of these students. This may be the very first opportunity that they've had to meet people from different backgrounds. And so how are we giving them the resources and the education that they need to carry this over into college? So though I understand that things are a little bit bleak right now, this is also an incredible opportunity to reach students that we may not have been able to.
Yeah, and I would follow up with that as well, thinking about what the digital space actually provides when you connect that way. Many of our students, when we think about the barriers that they have stated, it's financial, it's I can't leave because I need to work. Now, as Lamar pointed out, is greater access because everything's online. But I would also say I think that there's more space for creativity, and there's definitely more space for a deeper and more rich conversation. Due to the current events that have happened and looking at the experiences that many students have expressed that they've dealt with on campuses, now is the time where things again used to be taboo, to bring them to the forefront and say, actually, why are we doing things in the way that we're doing? Let's be radical and reconsider this.
I think, and this is what we were kind of talking about right before we all hopped on, just the fact that you were able to have a student panel that's speaking from and reaching people from all over, that doesn't normally happen. So I think that this is an opportunity to have more student voices in the mix. And then also in terms of professional development, there are just so many more opportunities that are becoming available to a wider amount of students. And I think that as long as we're making sure that we're working towards being able to provide students with what they need in terms of resources, Wi-Fi, electronics, et cetera, I think that we have some really cool opportunities to help students, shift out of certain socioeconomic statuses. I think we've got some really cool opportunities here. We just have to make sure that we're actually fostering them.
Thank you so much. I want to take a moment as well for the audience to encourage you to put your questions in for the New Directions crew, and we'll make sure to surface that back to them as well. Is there anything anyone else wants to add to what Suzanne, Lamar, or Candace has shared?
I would just share briefly that sorry.
No, you go first, girlfriend.
Okay, I would just comment that I think there's a really interesting opportunity to create community out of this struggle, because so many people, whether it's practitioners, students who are coming back from abroad, so many people I think are struggling in different ways, that people are seeking this community more so than ever before. And some of the most powerful conversations that I've been a part of or have listened to have been going on in the last 3 months. And so I think while there are lots of ways in which what's going on is really impactful and challenging, this is also, I think, an incredible opportunity to really develop that and to develop relationships that do cross borders, not just in the US, but overseas as well.
Lovely. I'm actually going to quote our dear friend Lamar Chambly, and that is, the foot's on the gas and it is not coming off. And so that absolutely is what is possible now that wasn't possible before, I believe. And, in this COVID season that we're in, the Rona has stripped away all the makeup. And so what we're getting is the real deal. And you can't unsee what we've seen. You can't unhear what we've heard, what we've experienced. And so we will not be going back.
Excellent. We have a question from the audience, and I'm going to read it and then expand on it a little bit. Kristen asks, how can I, as a white cis Gen X lady, be an effective study abroad advocate for my students of color who do not feel that study abroad is for them? Someone is saying, Shelley is saying yes. I'm going to expand that question as well to say, whose voices and work would you like to uplift to our audience to follow, read, listen to around identity, diversity, and inclusion? In addition, obviously, to what you have all shared from your own voices today, which we will be sharing with the audience in follow-up to ensure that they have access to your presentations and also the quotes and the resources you prepared in your presentations.
I think something I mentioned is to do the work. And that's a phrase. I'll give a shout out to Rachel Cargill, who I highly recommend to the person who asked that question, following her on Instagram. She has this concept of kind of doing the work of really understanding white supremacy, our role in it, white feminism, which is a big learning for me and is a continual learning about, I absolutely call myself a feminist, and absolutely there are ways that my feminism has been very white. So I think to start off with, that's my personal and first advice is to kind of go inward and think and learn and research. And now, we are living in a whole new world. I think the protest after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis has really launched us into this conversation. So I think that's a part of it. And then I think in terms of, speaking to students, I'm sure my other panelists have thoughts here. but sharing the mic is also, I think, powerful. That's something that has been happening on social media. So maybe in the practical sense, that looks like for white folks stepping back and giving people space who have experiences. What was the term you used, Candy? An architect, opportunity architect. I loved that idea.
Yeah, opportunity architecture is a concept that I was introduced to by my lovely friend Shelly Alfaro and Emma May, and we're going to be doing a presentation on that for Diversity Abroad later on. But I think that to go back to what you were saying, the most important piece to link the two together is the idea of sharing the mic. And one of the things that I really love doing when I go on campuses is hosting student panels and discussions, because it will be important for us to be able to use our resources and find creative ways to amplify student voices. So I don't know if you can speak more to this, Lamar, with regard to the K through 12 space, but one of the things that I've been seeing is just some of the leaders and teachers finding ways to upload videos and content and just letting the students themselves speak, because maybe there might be a situation where, you know, you feel like you don't have all the answers, and that's actually okay. That would be the time to lean on your community and say, well, I have a friend or I know someone, and here's how I can connect you to someone who may be able to speak more directly to your identity and experience. And that way it doesn't need to feel like you're saving the world or providing all the answers. You're just serving as the link.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for this question for lots of ways. Just thinking of my own experience in college and applying to study abroad programs. I knew that I wanted to study abroad, but it was a white presenting woman who straight up told me, you deserve to study abroad. I'm going to advocate for you because you deserve this space. So even though she was visually very different than me, as an educator, she advocated for my right to study abroad. And that, again, just because I'm using this word a lot, that felt empowering to feel cared for in that way, that a white woman would say, you deserve this. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge the racial disparity that exists in study abroad, being very clear about the data. Here are the numbers. These are, stats, and be clear about that, but then also use it as a way to show students, like, not many Black students or students of color have this opportunity. I am going to make sure that you have everything that you need to enjoy this experience, that you have the mental health resources when you come back to take care of yourself. Malika addressed the F's framework and thinking about family, fear, finances, and faculty. And so if there's any way that you could prepare those responses beforehand, would just mean the world to say, nope, I already have a plan for this. Your family's not interested. Cool, I have an idea for this. And just being there and advocating for the students, I think would be incredibly powerful.
Lamar, your comments about someone advocating for you when you were in college and entering into this process reminds me of something we heard from Fabiola Rio yesterday on the opening panel, where she said, everybody wants to be invited. Right? Feels good. And that came up again in a different panel on hosting digital events, where a faculty member shared, students want to be invited. And I just think that advocacy and invitation are two concepts that are pretty great to work with, if I understand you correctly. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to comment on that before we move on to a different question or deepen what has been said already?
I do, just maybe one or two pieces directly to all of the great points that have been lifted up. I think at the center really is looking at belonging. And so when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, remembering that at the heart of all of this is belonging. And that's where we're all striving, to achieve and to foster those spaces. To our friend who lifted up the question in the chat, our white cisgendered friend, I would say, holding each other accountable is one of the main things that we can do going forward. And then another piece is looking at, again, how can we all have agency, we all have platforms, so how can we leverage that power, our collective power, to dismantle systemic racism that exists in our space. We can do it.
We can do it. I'm going to shift gears a little bit because there's a theme that really came up pretty strongly in your presentations, which is Generation Z, sharing the mic, being prepared for change. I love the comment about they're going to show up proud of who they are. There's a lot there. The friends, how to be a friend to Gen Z. So someone brought up this idea, and I'm looking at my notes here, about rules. Oh, here it is. That we should be prepared to break some rules. So I'm going to put the question back to all of you. Which rules should we be prepared or try to break for the next generation, or for ourselves to get out of the way for the next generation?
I have a quick hit. Rules around hiring. We talk a lot about representation in the industry. Again, Malika shared those stats. 65% of practitioners are white, like myself. And I think I took this great course, actually, Samantha and I took a course on whiteness at work last summer, which I can share a link to. One of the suggestions there was look at what barriers are in place when it comes to the quote unquote qualifications you have for a role. Do you, for example, and I know other folks have said this, but do you have a requirement of global experience in your office? And really looking critically at those and asking, is this necessary to be successful in this role? And is this going to actually be a barrier for us to get more people in the room and at the table?
Yeah, to add on to that, I think that's really important. I remember being a young college student, and part of my reason for wanting to study abroad was me wanting to have that experience of cross-cultural exchange, but I absolutely knew that I needed to do something to make myself stand out. And I was in a privileged position to be able to study abroad and to have people who were leading me and guiding me. But just, I think the concept of, again, what does it mean to be and look professional? And what does it mean to be quote unquote qualified and have experience? I noted the concept and the idea of creativity, and this generation is absolutely creative and they want the space to create more. So considering what type of experience does a person actually need in order to join a workforce or a team, and are they teachable and coachable as opposed to what's just on paper? Because these students are adaptable. I mean, they've shown us that time and time again. So as they come out, and considering the space that we're in now, that we're hosting this online versus, being in person like we normally would be, connecting with you all, this is a testament to the new space that we're entering into. And quite frankly, we're catching up. They've already been there. So I think that would be something that would be really important to think about. And I mean, I think about my students when I was teaching in Laos and teaching in China and teaching in Turkey. They were connected and more alike to my students in New Orleans and Baltimore and DC than I ever would have imagined because of technology. So considering, again, that concept of professionalism, what does your hair look like? Do you have tattoos? Can you actually do the work? And are you creative? I think that will probably be the most important thing to me.
I think it could also be something along the lines of, this might hit a nerve, what programs we approve, or what our perceptions are of which programs are true study abroad immersion opportunities. If a student has a requirement for their program to study abroad, is a virtual internship with an international organization and a supervisor whose native language is different from that student, I think that could just be quite as valuable. So I think maybe like relooking at what we think the standard is.
I'm going to say it's I'm going to go over to Michaela's space in the marketing and comm space. And I think there are so many opportunities to do things differently. And it's very much not enough to have a student testimonial once in a while, or to make sure that your pictures are moving beyond, one single white girl in the park in Barcelona. And don't get me wrong, that is a good start, but really getting, I think, authentic student voices in there, and not just all the good, like study abroad will change your life, or it'll be, the best decision you've ever made. Because I mean, I remember studying abroad and every day was not the best day of my life. It was a challenging semester. And that's great, but that was never the narrative. And I think we have to be real about this, and we have to be real about what's difficult about this, and what's difficult if you are having Candace's experience of being a Black woman in Morocco, or, you know, I mean, it's because the experience also isn't the same for everyone. And I think we have to stop making it look like this very exciting, curated, perfect experience, because we've all been there and we know that's not what it is.
You're getting a lot of head nods and fingers.
Yeah, I'm trying to make room, so I'm muting myself.
How about come on in, Malika? We're having fun, like you said we were at the beginning. I'd love to hear what you how you want to build on what's
yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, so Sister Candy, what you said actually really touched my heart. And that is, I want to amplify assets. I want to amplify assets, particularly among folks who are from historically marginalized or minoritized groups. Because guess what, y'all? They ain't as fragile as you think. And as a matter of fact, you know, a lot of these skills, such as, you know, being able to navigate, you know, through ambiguity, these cross-cultural communication skills, relationship building, management, they got that in spades. Okay. So let's look at assets, because they got it. They're coming with it strong.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. All right. I've got my next question here, and it's really about the role of international educators, however you define that, right? K through 12, higher ed, crossing over into those different spaces. How do you think your role and the role of international educators writ large, how does it need to change in the next decade? How do you want to see it change in the next decade? Like in 10 years, if we're having this conversation, what does it look like to be like, this is what I do day to day? And that's amazing, because 10 years ago, I was doing this. Did I stump the panel? Wasn't trying to stump the panel, but this question fascinates
they know me because I'm making room. So I'm now entering 2 decades in this field. And, you know, I think about the progress that's been made, or not enough progress that's been made, rather, around looking at some of the historically marginalized groups. And so I want to lift up a fact. The fact is, you know, up until several years ago, STEM. Okay. I'm not throwing shade on STEM, to be clear, but STEM majors were underrepresented in education abroad. So what did the community do? We rallied. Oh, we rallied. We created programs specifically for STEM. We did marketing specifically for STEM. We pumped money into STEM. And guess what? Now, who are, you know, which population is the, you know, studying abroad in the strongest numbers? STEM. So what does that tell me? We can enact change in our community. And so 10 years from now, I do not want to see the same little did. I want to see representation on par with representation and who's coming to campus. Okay, I'm gonna pass the mic.
+1, Malika, +1. I really am like hung up on this concept of getting radical and not accepting, you know, not accepting slow change. And I think this is something I've learned from folks who do organizing work. And a lot of times it's like, just wait, change is going to come. And now we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement, and Generation Z is leading the way. And they are like, we are done waiting. We do not want to wait. We want rapid social change. And I feel the same way about this industry. It's like we have inched. I used to work at IIE, and I watch the open doors numbers every year, and we kind of pat ourselves on the back. We're like, oh, good, there's more students of color going abroad. We have, we started looking at, you know, students with disabilities going abroad. And to Malika's point, I mean, it's going to take us 100 years if we continue at this pace that we have been in terms of representation and having study abroad look like student population. And I want to build on something Mitch Gordon said at a session we had on funding at the beginning, actually, way back yesterday, was he said, what would the world look like today if 10 years ago, 80% of our students were studying abroad? And I want to add to that and say, what if of those 80% of students, it was actually representative of the makeup of our country and our institutions?
Yeah, I think to add to that point, for me, I keep considering the concept of equity in education. And what I would really love to see is a better bridging of the gap between K through 12 and the higher ed space. Um, Again, I had the privilege of teaching some really amazing students in New Orleans and in Baltimore. And I think about some of those students and their transition to the higher ed space. And even when I go on different campuses in the Northeast region and explaining to a student what study abroad is, what it could possibly, the doors it could open up for them, and just my own journey as an African American woman, not really understanding what the actual process was. And to me, I think that what we would really want to do in the future is try to find ways to really connect. If you want your students to go to college, not just to get there, but to and through, figuring out better links and a better relationship, not only between those two spaces, but also the community, right? I've been on several campuses where I have facilitated DEI events, and they're very isolated. And when I get an opportunity to speak to students, whether they be an international student from a Caribbean country or whether they be, just a student from the inner city of New York, right? There are different cultures within American culture, and finding ways to say, okay, how am I making space for these students if they come from a different type of high school or whatever the case may be, to have them really feel, like you all said, belonging, right? And when I created the friend framework, that was really what it was all about. Because if you notice, everything has to do with how can I connect and relate to another person. I'm absolutely a connector, as Malcolm Gladwell would say. I'm absolutely that person. And so in every space, I think about how are we finding ways to connect the links. I don't want to hear another student say, I don't like it on my campus because I feel like my teachers don't like me, or my professor told me that study abroad is not for me. That's unacceptable in my personal opinion. I think that everyone is welcome here, and we can absolutely do better at bridging that gap. So
We can do better. It's a great line for us all to take home. We've got time for one more question, and then I'm going to wrap us up. We have a question from Sharon Miller. For short-term faculty-led programs, what suggestions do you have for preparing faculty leaders to be an advocate and a support system for students of color or LGBTQIA plus students while abroad?
I know you want to share the mic, but this is your wheelhouse, Malika. So
So the reoccurring theme that you're hearing today is that the work starts with oneself. It all begins with us. And so to that end, for faculty program directors, I would warmly welcome, highly encourage, starting with unpacking your own social identities, because as I mentioned in my remarks, looking at this framework of inclusive pedagogy. So thinking about how our identities as instructors, as advisors, has a direct impact on the learning experience for our students. And then they themselves, as the receivers of this, of the learning in that sort of shared space, they too are receiving it based on their own social identities. And so starting from that point is one that I think is really important.
Thank you so much, Malika. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that?
I would just also add, I don't think that this just has to be the professor's work and our work too. I think that there's a space for group dynamic training to make sure that on these faculty-led programs that the group is understanding each other's identities and how those will present, like what Malika was saying, and then how the group can then support and in some cases protect each other, because I think that that's somewhat missing on faculty-led programs.
Excellent.
Being a friend to each other. Candy.
Just unmute, Malika. Just unmute. No, no, absolutely. I think how many times have we heard from students who they go on a program and then they come back and you realize the issue that they had was with their classmate, not anyone else. So I think it'll be important to be prepared and set expectations ahead of time, not only for the trip, but what's going to happen when we get back, right? Returning engagement is a whole other conversation that we could go into, but setting the tone for community, similar to what Malika does with the community requests. One of the things that I used to do in my classrooms was create a cooperation contract. And the question that I would ask everyone in the classroom, I don't care if they were kindergarten or if they were adults, what do we need to make sure that we make a safe space and we get the most out of our experience? So that's just one simple example, but it sets the tone and creates a space of love and community ahead of time, so that if there are difficult and brave conversations that do need to happen, then you are ahead of it, as opposed to feeling like I didn't even know.
Mm-hmm. For a resource, on your campuses, so the folks who work in the alternative break space, they've been doing this work really, really well. And that's where you see these great intersections of social justice education, service learning. And so to that end, connecting with them, they can give you or your faculty a lot of really concrete tools to use for ongoing reflections. So directly to Candy's point, working on building that community before students go, because as has been lifted up, oftentimes so that's the dirty little secret of study abroad, is what goes on in them groups, right? The intra-group conflict and dynamics. And so the alternative break folks do a great job with that. And that's a space that we can learn a lot from.
Thank you so much, Malika. That'll be our last word from the panel today. I want to thank you all so much again for your time, your talents, joining us at the VIA TRM Bold Conference. Folks are eagerly asking for follow-up and this and that, and I want access to these resources. So don't worry, we'll give the people what they want. It's going to take us a little bit of time to pull all these fantastic ideas and resources together, but I promise you we will share it with the community. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our tech support, Joey and Trevor, and Miriam and Leslie. Thank you so much to the VIA TRM team for this week, and for all of our panelists and our audience members and our clients. We hope you have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you again soon. We are going offline now. Take care, be well.